You cannot make a deal with Putin from a position of weakness unless your intention is to surrender to Putin or have Ukraine be the sacrificial lamb. Peace through strength is not selling your ally down the river.
From the Russians' point of view, this is Christmas. You're simply watching the collapse of the unity of the Western alliance. But what's really striking is the degree to which there is also that note of caution. Trump could easily turn, and who knows what can happen.
Is the Russian mindset at the moment that stopping the war where it is and freezing the lines where they are is a big compromise? Or is it a relief? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy. So Donald Trump is freezing American military aid to Ukraine. It's a massive shock and it's caused ructions all over Europe and in Ukraine, while Zelenskyy was busy trying to thank America and get things back on track. All the while, we wonder what Russia is making of this and what they might want in any kind of negotiation. To discuss all of that, the doyen of CNN News and world political interviewing, Christiane Amanpour, and the honorary professor at UCL and expert in modern Russia, Mark Galeotti. So Christiane, first of all, here we have Europe desperately trying to keep the ship sailing smoothly, drag Ukraine back into a negotiation with the United States. Zelensky's out there saying, thank you, every other minute. And then Donald Trump just, puts the boot down even harder.
Yeah, I really think we ought to sort of try to figure out what his negotiating and deal-making strategy is. Look, this is a continuation of what J.D. Vance started at the Munich Security Conference and that he and Trump have doubled down on in the intervening 2 weeks, essentially wanting a quick deal with Russia. At the first, freezing out Ukraine and Europe, then, clearly knowing that they had to be at the table, but in the interim has been constantly delegitimizing Ukraine. And now the final blow is to suspend actual aid. So the question is, why? What is Trump doing? If you say that he's a great deal maker, then you have to figure out how you make a deal. Clearly, you cannot make a deal with Putin from a position of weakness unless your intention is to surrender to Putin or have Ukraine be the sacrificial lamb and give it to Putin. The whole point of the NATO support for Ukraine, even if they never thought that in this instance they could get back Crimea or beat Russia necessarily, it was to give Ukraine a strong enough hand to be able to bargain at a table eventually. Now the Trump administration is basically flipping the script on its head, saying that Ukraine doesn't want peace, deliberately, it appears to me, misrepresenting what Zelenskyy has been saying, trying to tell the world that he says he doesn't want a ceasefire, he doesn't want peace. This is not true. I've covered Zelenskyy and I've covered this story since the beginning. Of course they want peace, but they want it in a just, honorable fashion. They want it with a backstop. They want it with a security guarantee. And this is what all this is about. So you have to ask yourself, peace through strength is what Trump has been, declaiming. But peace through strength is not selling your ally down the river and weakening your ally. That gives strength to the adversary. So now, and maybe Mark knows much more about this, the adversary is being given, succor by the United States. Putin is hearing everything he wants from the United States. And even Dmitry Peskov, his spokesman this week, said, this new administration's foreign policy is changing in ways that fit our vision. I'm kind of paraphrasing, but that's what he said.
Yes, Mark, if the American position is that Russia already holds all the cards in their terms, why would America feel the need to give them even more?
I think because you have to realize that although we might well disagree with this, as far as Putin is concerned, precisely because his forces are, albeit at terrible cost, continuing to advance, there is a sense that it is a concession for him to even entertain the notion of stopping his continued advance. That is his concession. But at the same time, there is also a fundamental point here that actually Trump and Putin share a certain sense of the world. And that is that there are a handful of countries which are decision makers. and then the rest, the lot of the rest of the world, is essentially just simply to be told what to do by whoever happens to be your patron. And I think it's very clear from Trump's point of view that he thinks that precisely as these great powers, it will be Russia and the United States that will decide Ukraine's fate, and Ukraine is a vassal that does not know its place. And so I think that's why we have this continued onslaught against Zelensky and indeed Ukraine. It is to basically tell them, look, you shut up. We have bought and paid for you with all our aid, and therefore we will make a deal. We may well come back to you at a later point and make sure that all the various elements you can contribute to, but nonetheless, bottom line is you do what you're told. And I think from the Russians' point of view, on the one hand, they clearly appreciate that. I mean, this is Christmas, after all, for them, in terms of all the advantages that they're getting, and just simply watching the collapse of the unity of the Western alliance. But what's really striking is the degree to which there is also that note of caution, because what Trump giveth, Trump can taketh away. That they too are now living in Trump world, and there's that sense of Trump could easily turn, and who knows what can happen. They don't like not being able to predict things.
It is not just Ukraine, though, that is being told, do what you are told. It is the rest of the world. It's Europe as well. I mean, if you look at J.D. Vance's interview with Hannity last night, he again says Donald Trump's the only guy with a plan. He's the only guy with a strategy. And this idea of a minerals deal and American workers digging minerals out of the ground in Ukraine is way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that has not fought a war in 30 or 40 years. That's caused massive offense in Britain and France this morning. Christiane, I mean, obviously Trump has his supporters and his army behind him, but does the whole of America buy into this?
No. And if you take the latest polls, the majority of Americans believe that Putin is the bad guy in this, that Ukraine is the victim. Clearly, there is a sense of war fatigue, but don't forget, Americans are not fighting a war. Ukrainians are fighting a war, and they are, being given and actually sold, as you all know. A lot of the money that goes to Ukraine is then plowed back into the American defense industry to buy weapons. What they're giving to Ukraine is all of the NATO countries, as was explained to me this week again, is pretty much old stocks that they then are able to give, and then they're able to replenish. It's a very, traditional way of helping an ally. And remember, the allies said for years, we will do this, quote unquote, for as long as it takes. I think there's several issues here. First and foremost, Russia is, as you all know, a much bigger, much stronger military than Ukraine's in terms of people who fight and in terms of its equipment and its military. It's still not winning. It's making only incremental gains over the last 24 months or 12 months. Throughout 2024, it made only incremental gains. And this is with, if you remember this time last year, President Trump, campaigner Trump, had his MAGA allies in Congress stop any aid going to Ukraine. It took about 7 months before they unblocked it. And Ukraine had to keep fighting on. And I spoke in Ukraine on the front lines with the commanding General Syrskyi, commander of all the armed services, who said, yeah, this cost us lives and a bit of territory, and it's really bad. But we still did it. And so I think the notion that Russia is winning and Russia has all the cards is not entirely accurate. And I think the idea that Ukraine is going to suddenly give up, as hard as this might be, is potentially wishful thinking. And I think, finally, I'd say, has one who's actually covered the United States and Britain actually at war over the last 30, 40 years. Just go back to the second Iraq War of 2003. Britain was on the ground with the United States. So for J.D. Vance to say that about an ally, Keir Starmer apparently had a good reception from President Trump. You have to ask yourself what is going on, because none of it makes any sense other than what Mark has just said, that they want to go back to some late 19th century, early 20th century division of great powers and, including China, and divide the world up. But that is so yesterday. It's so last century.
I mean, J.D. Vance has also denied that he meant Britain and France, but hasn't said who he who he maybe did mean.
How can you deny when only Britain and France have actually put up, the notion of troops? No, they keep sticking their foot in their mouth and then having to pull it out. The real issue, though, is for Trump, it appears politics is personal. Look what he's doing with his allies, Canada and Mexico, and maybe soon the EU with tariffs, and his adversary, China. But why with the allies? Why? And I think that this personal spat and animosity between Trump and Zelensky, which goes back to the famous phone call, to the famous moment that led to Trump's impeachment. You can't help but wonder when American commentators say, politics is personal for Trump. And sadly, right now, it's over a war that is existential, not just for Ukraine, but for all of us.
Mark, what is the actual effect, though, of an American freeze on aid if it continues? I mean, people are saying Ukraine can carry on for perhaps a couple of months. Is that effectively what he's done? He's limited the war now to a couple of months' time. And at that point, Ukraine has to stop.
No. I mean, we're talking about in a couple of months' time, that's when you'll begin to feel the appreciable impact thereof. Remember, this aid doesn't come as a single sort of stream as if from a tap. It's always been sort of in dribs and drabs, a shipment that comes and then there's a pause and so forth. So the Ukrainians are used to this. And, we don't really know what their stockpiles are like. But nonetheless, they will clearly be able to fill the gaps for a while. The question is precisely what happens if it goes longer. Really, by the time you're getting to, say, between 4 and 6 months, that's when you're likely to really feel it. And we'll begin to feel it not just in the obvious terms of, a lack of particular missiles or whatever, but also in the sort of smaller and apparently trivial but absolutely crucial elements like spare parts. The Ukrainians will fight as long as they feel they can fight. But nonetheless, their capacity to do so, and particularly in terms of long-range fires, which they've been using, things like the ATACMS and so forth, long-range missiles, to disrupt the Russian offensive capacity by hitting ammunition dumps and the like a long way behind the lines. That kind of thing will all begin to slow down.
So how will Russia view this? I mean, given how fast Donald Trump tends to announce things and can flip and do a 180-degree turn, will they be looking at this and thinking this actually has an impact on the battlefield? Or is it just well, that's what he said today?
Well, look, I mean, obviously at the moment, it's hard for them not to feel pretty exultant. What I find really interesting is we're already beginning to see a coded debate take place within the Russian elite, largely being played out within the media. Because after all, Putin has this infamously narrow circle of people he actually talks to and listens to. So in some ways, if you want to get through to the boss, there's no point writing a memo and hoping it'll go through 15 different bureaucratic levels and end up on his desk. You need to find other ways of attracting his attention. And one of the classic ones is precisely in the media. And so we're already seeing some elements, the more technocratic types who are actually saying, think of how great it would be if we could reach an early peace. If we could basically in some way stabilize the situation, sure, in control of the occupied territories, but with, for example, at least some degree of sanctions relief, then we could begin to alleviate the long-term damage, which is absolutely crucial. The scarring that is taking place to the Russian politics, its economy, and indeed its demographics. Must remember that we're all talking about almost 1 million dead and wounded already. So they're basically talking up the advantage of seizing this as an opportunity for some kind of a peace. Conversely, you've got the nationalists groups, things like, say, the Tsargrad TV station run by a sort of orthodox nationalist oligarch, who are saying quite the opposite, who are saying, actually, we will not be forgiven in history if we don't take this opportunity to resolve this issue for once and for all, which is their coded way of saying not just fix the conflict as it is now and call it a victory, but instead advance and essentially try to impose, again, some sort of sphere of influence control over Ukraine as a whole. So, it's interesting that the Russians see this as certainly a historic opportunity. It's one that they're cautious about, but it seems to be one where they don't think there is a clear intent from the top. And that's true because Putin, in some ways, much like Trump, again, another similarity, Putin likes, instead of having some kind of clear long-term strategy with a set of milestones and such like, he likes creating dynamic, complex situations which create all sorts of different opportunities from which he can pick and choose. And the one he picks today may not be the one he will be picking tomorrow. So I think, from Putin's point of view, he probably is also sitting there and trying to work out what is the sort of the best opportunity for him now.
Christiane, what we don't know, because curiously, this debate has been about, first of all, stopping the war and then about security guarantees. But what we haven't heard from the Americans is a vision of, where you stop the war, where the borders are, what Ukrainian sovereignty actually means. Is it the whole of Ukraine? Is it Ukraine 2014, Ukraine 2022, or Ukraine as it is now? I mean, what do you think the administration thinks Russia will settle for?
I don't know. And I think that is a huge question, because otherwise we're just talking in fantasy land here. None of us know what is the substance of what President Trump has been speaking to President Putin about. Have they talked substance? What is the deal? We don't know. What we do know is what Putin has been saying since the beginning, and all his, all his acolytes, that they have maximalist goals. Even last week or 2 weeks ago, he said X number of all the territories that we have and beyond are non-negotiable. As you know, they want even the territory they haven't yet conquered or occupied, some of it. So that we know that they keep saying, obviously, no NATO, that's their line, but they also say no militarized Ukraine. So what? Ukraine is meant to give up its own army, its own military. They want no sovereign and independent and democratic Ukraine. They want a vassal state, as you all discussed at the beginning, because Putin does not want an independent, sovereign, democratic, westward-leaning Ukraine. That has been his goal from the beginning. And I think it really behooves us to remember and cast our minds back to Minsk I and Minsk II. I just reread the history around it to refresh myself. And this was, again, it was an attempt by Angela Merkel and I think President Hollande and others with Putin and at that time President Poroshenko of Ukraine to get a quick deal and a ceasefire. And they got this deal and they wrote it down and it was Minsk I and all the rest of it. But there was no enforcement. And so it collapsed. Didn't collapse once, it collapsed twice. So there's two cautionary tales there. One, you can't just rush into a deal. And I'm trying to internalize. It's not a good idea to try to read Trump's mind. But you remember in the campaign, he said, I can fix this overnight, even before I'm inaugurated. Then it was in the first 100 days. Then it was, I don't know what. What Trump wants is a quick deal and a quick victory. But that's why he's so mad at Zelensky for saying this is going to take a while to figure out. Zelensky spoke the truth. All the Europeans say that too. It's going to take a while to figure it out. And, finally, it's not going to work without a security guarantee. We've actually seen that on that territory after the 2014 invasion of eastern Ukraine. So all of this is laid out for us. We know the picture. And the notion that Ukraine or Europe is going to take Trump's word that I don't know, a phone call with Putin is a guarantee, they're not going to do it. Europe won't do it. Even now, as they're stepping up, at least this is what they're telling us on the air, paying the money, you're trying to come up with a peace plan with Ukraine at the table, wanting to take it to the US. They can't do it without a US backstop. That means US air power, over like a no-fly zone and watching from above, US air defenses and intelligence. That, at the very least, is what they need from the United States. And unless Trump et al. Is willing to give that, I don't think there's a peace deal to be had, and nobody can force anybody into it. And then you have to see whether Russia can do what it couldn't do in February of 2022, which is conquer the whole place.
I mean, Mark, when we talk about Trump now, we increasingly say don't take him literally, take him seriously. Given all the things that Christiane has just said, Russia has made explicit about its negotiating position, do we take them literally?
No, but we have to realize that they are operating within a very sort of a classic Russian and then Soviet model of negotiation, which is absolutely, you start with obscenely high demands that you present as being unnegotiable, the absolute minimum, because you anticipate that you are going to be haggled down, and you assume that your less ruthless antagonists in the West will naturally, because of something it's encoded in their DNA, want to make a deal. And so you will be haggled down from obscene to merely profane in terms of how much more you get than you should. Because if we look, for example, take one of the most ridiculous elements of what the Russians said they were fighting this war was the denazification of Ukraine. I mean, putting aside just how ludicrous that is, we see that this is one thing that seems to fade in and out as it is convenient. The Russians are deeply cynical. And if they had to abandon an ally or whatever, they would. Because we have to realize that the Russians are also hinting that there is room for lateral negotiation. That maybe their roles in Africa might be up for grabs. Maybe their relationship with North Korea will no longer need to be quite so close if they're not fighting a war. So I think, again, the Russians are deeply opportunist. They will not give any gifts away. They will push for everything they can possibly get. But I don't think we can assume that they're actually saying, we will continue fighting for the last soldier, even if it means destabilizing the country, just because of these formally stated requirements.
But is the Russian mindset at the moment that stopping the war where it is and freezing the lines where they are is a big compromise? Or is it a relief?
Well, I mean, again, I think for most Russians, frankly, it would be a relief. We already know that more than 70% of them, when polled, said they would happily accept any kind of peace deal that Putin is willing to sign. For Putin himself, I mean, again, unfortunately, crawling into the deep, dark recesses of his mind is in many ways as unsatisfying and useless as trying to Trump read as well. But I mean, I think one thing we can say is Putin will be able to spin keeping what he's got now as a victory because he has absolute control over the media space in Russia, and because so many Russians will be just so relieved to think that this is not going to then also devour their husband, their brother, their son, their father, or whatever. There is a real fear about where this may go. So in some ways, it'll be a case of everyone having an incentive to talk about how extraordinarily magnificent the emperor's new clothes are. So, I mean, I think, we have to realize that Trump, sorry, there you go, there's a Freudian slip there. Putin is essentially interested in himself, in his survival. And to that end, if he feels that his survival will be imperiled by not taking this opportunity and thinking, well, in that case, this war may drag on for years and completely crash the economy, then he has an incentive. But of course, so much of that, therefore, depends on just how plausible a deterrent the thought of the war continuing. If it looks like anyway the Ukrainians are being hung out to dry, then you probably don't feel you have to worry about this war going on for a couple of years. If the Europeans don't actually manage to convert yet another round of rousing statements of support for Ukraine into real moves that have an impact on the battlefield, then Putin won't be deterred. So, I mean, I think it's very much in that, to use a cliche, all to play for territory.
How bad would it be, Christiane, if Donald Trump doesn't get his way for him? I mean, in that bust up in the Oval Office, he said, "Do a deal or we're out." Well, I mean, they've now frozen the lines, but I mean, do we get to a point ever where he can just say, "Okay"?
By the way, premature. Because all weekend, Europe and Ukraine have been talking about doing a deal. All weekend. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy has again been, expressing his gratitude. The notion that he hasn't been grateful is just a farce. Every single time he goes to a foreign capital, every time he's invited to a Zoom meeting at the EU or NATO or some defense council or a national parliament, he first says thank you for your help. So this is all a made up personal antagonistic thing that's getting in the way of the strategic demands here. And what we haven't talked about is the big picture, really. And the big picture, according to so many of the American commentators, this is the end of Pax Americana. This is a perversion of American foreign policy. What happened in the White House, the Oval, on Friday was, according to a conservative commentator, Brett Stevens, a day of American infamy. He said, imagine if Roosevelt had told Churchill at the height of the war, or when he was most desperate, to negotiate on any terms with Hitler, at the same time demanding his coal reserves. Imagine what that would look like and what that would be. So, and one other cautionary tale, a deal, the only actual major deal that Donald Trump has made in 1.0 is the Afghanistan deal. That was his. It was massively, awfully executed by the Biden administration, but that was his deal. And essentially, his deal-making consisted of having the Taliban at the table, essentially freezing out the legitimate elected government, no matter what you think about them, the American and Western-backed government of Afghanistan. And he trusted the Taliban, he said, to keep women's rights and all the things that people want, human rights, going. And he handed Afghanistan back to the Taliban on a silver platter. That is what Ukraine is worried about. That is what Europe is worried about. And the question, why do they still keep doubling down, attacking not just Ukraine and the president, but Europe? What is the strategic relevance of that other than, if there is a plan, is it to destroy Europe? Why do they keep doing this? Having said Europe, it's you have to step up. Why then denigrate them and belittle them?
Well, it's quite clear he really doesn't like the European Union and would like to see it weakened. Isn't the answer to the question?
This is not about the European Union. This is about Britain.
No, of course. But as an institution, he hates the European Union as well, doesn't he? So, isn't the answer to your question that the future is America first? That he's delivering on his election platform of saying the future is transactional and it's about America first.
Fine. So pull back, America. Stay behind your fortress, but don't denigrate everybody else who now are left to pick up the pieces. This is really serious because it puts democracy right in his crosshairs, and it makes, apparently, authoritarianism and dictatorship and all the rest of it the preferred option. There are serious commentators and analysts in the United States talking about how the Trump administration, how Trump and Vance are moving America away from this 75-year post-World War II American-led world order and all the way towards what Mark was saying, and that is dividing the world and having your own spheres of influence. Only that time has passed.
Yes, within that, the time has passed, it seems, where America felt that its role was to defend democracy. And that obviously makes you question whether Trump really is a Democrat.
This administration, the Trump administration, the rest of America, certainly the polls suggest that democracy is their preferred option, and that they believe in America's historic promise, America's values, what America's sold and given to the world for all these years, and I don't think Americans are ready to give up on the democratic process. And as I said, most of them believe in the latest poll that Putin is the bad guy here.
Mark, you mentioned Russia's other world strategies and alliances, Russia and its new Africa strategy, Russia and North Korea. Does it actually have the resource and the commitments to follow these things through, or are they and compete with China in any meaningful way, or are these mirages?
No, this is very much guerrilla geopolitics. It's being done on the cheap. If one looks at Africa, for example, back in Soviet times, the Soviet Union spent huge amounts of aid and support to basically try and buy itself influence and allies. These days, the Russians in Africa actually have to be self-financing. Indeed, ideally, they're meant to be making a profit for Moscow. And I think that's the general pattern. Russia is not in a position, it is not a great power. The usual sort of snarky comparisons of a GDP the size of Spain's and so forth don't really apply, because economics isn't like that, and the Russians are basically buying from themselves most of their weapons and everything else. But nonetheless, it is clear that that's not the case. And you mentioned China. That is one of the key issues, and there's a fascinating generational divide within the Russian elite. As far as Putin is concerned, this struggle in Ukraine, and remember, he regards himself as being in effect at war with the West as a whole. Ukraine, this is a proxy war with NATO, with the West, and it's just one flank of that. This is the war for him that is going to determine not only his political survival, but also his political legacy. And in effect, he's willing to do whatever it takes. And if it means, in effect, becoming more and more of a vassal of China's, then so be it. The next political generation down, the ones who are sort of waiting with some impatience for when they get to take over, they're much more concerned about the long term, and they're actually much more concerned about precisely Russia's relationship with China. But again, at the moment, they're not being listened to. So I think what we actually see is Putin is as a transitional figure, the last of the true Homo Sovieticus, who is so consumed with his desire to make Russia great again, to once again bring it to the center of the world stage, that he's mortgaging or indeed destroying Russia's long-term prospects in order to meet the needs of today.
And just on the China point, I mean, that's the one thing he hasn't been very vocal about since taking office. Is that next?
He's thrown tariffs at China already, and they have retaliated. So that could be really serious, and it could affect the entire global economy. Another issue is he's cut USAID. USAID was America's arm of soft power, and that gave America the ability to show itself as a human face to all those who might have gravitated towards Russia or others, right? It was created by President Kennedy in 1961. He had read a book called The Ugly American, how people around the world viewed America as just a rapacious, imperialist, conquering power. And he wanted to show something different, not just for altruistic reasons, but also to pull them away from, at that time, the Soviet Union. That's gone. So suddenly the ugly American that Kennedy feared is back. And we don't know where that's going to lead and who it will benefit. After Munich, your former Prime Minister, John Major, took the extraordinary step of coming back out onto the media and saying what we just heard in Munich from J.D. Vance is going to make Putin and Xi Jinping dance with joy, and it signifies a very dangerous realignment of America vis-a-vis the transatlantic alliance and world politics. And he was absolutely right. He said it more than 2 weeks ago, and this week, this is what we are reporting on, because that's all happened. We don't know whether he'll pull it back, Trump, but right now that's exactly where we are. A very dangerous realignment for those of us who believe in democracy, human rights, sovereignty, the rules of the road, thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. It's a very, very new place that we're in right now.
Christiane, Mark, that was a great conversation. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.